Fora TV. The world is thinking.
So we begin this week with Dr. Kenneth Miller, professor of biology at Brown University. His research on cell membrane structure and function has produced more than 50 scientific papers and reviews in leading journals, including Cell, Nature, and Scientific American. In 2007, he was named a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and received the Exploratorium Museum of San Francisco's Outstanding Educator Award. He is co-author of 4 high school and biology textbooks. Dr. Miller's other books include Finding Darwin's God, a scientist's search for common ground between God and evolution, and Only a Theory, Evolution and the Battle for America's Soul. A nationally recognized expert on evolution, Dr. Miller has testified in court cases on the topic, including the controversial 2005 trial Kitzmiller versus Dover Area School District, involving the teaching of intelligent design in public schools in Pennsylvania. Dr. Miller has appeared on many national news programs. He is an advisor on life sciences to the NewsHour on PBS. Most noteworthy to his students, and surely to some of you, are his appearances on Comedy Central's The Colbert Report. I'm happy to tell you that he also has served for many years as an umpire for the NCAA. Dr. Miller's lecture is titled God, Darwin, and Design, America's Continuing Problem with Evolution. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to Chautauqua Dr. Kenneth Miller.
Thank you very much, especially for that very kind introduction. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to speak to such a distinguished group. And it's especially an honor to kick off this extraordinary week of lectures on the theory of evolution, looking forward to the 200th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. One never knows how one is going to be introduced, of course, so I always bring my own introductory slide so I can tell people who I really am. I am a cell biologist. I work on biological membrane structure and function. These are some pictures of myself in my lab and an electron micrograph or two from the sort of work that I do. How does a nice cell biologist get messed up in something like evolution? Well, the short answer might be that evolution pervades everything in biology. But the somewhat longer answer is that a few years ago, a former student of mine named Joseph Levine convinced me to do something absolutely crazy, and that was to sit down and write with him a high school biology textbook. And to our absolute amazement, these books took off. These are the covers of several of the editions of these books, and they are now used in about 40% of the high school classrooms in the United States. Now, I've been blessed with 2 daughters. My oldest daughter, Lauren, managed to escape from Dighton-Rehoboth Regional High School in Massachusetts before my first book was published. But my younger daughter, Tracy, was not so lucky. And she had the ultimate indignity of having her old man's textbook inflicted upon her in 9th grade biology in high school. The town I live in, called Rehoboth, Massachusetts, is a very small town, only about 8,000 people. And for quite a few years, this was before I became an umpire, people knew who I was. And the reason for that is for about 7 or 8 of those years, I was sort of the commissioner of the girls' softball program in town. I organized the spaghetti suppers to raise money. I coached our all-star team in the summer. I trained our umpires, stuff like that. So everybody knew me as the softball guy, but they didn't know what I did for a living. So one day, the high school adopted these books, and my name was in the cover and my picture was on the inside. All of a sudden, the cover was blown. Everybody knew what I did for a living. And one day, you might think that's a good thing. But one day I pull up to the high school. It's in the fall, first year they're using the book. I was picking Tracy up after field hockey practice. And a woman I knew through softball, one of the other coaches, Bonnie Kelly, flags me down. And Bonnie says, Ken, you wrote the book that they're using at the high school now. And I threw my chest out, and I got that big dumb look on my face that you get when you think someone's about to compliment you. And I said, yes, yes, Bonnie, I did. And then she said, funny thing is, you don't seem that smart. You may make of that as you will. I've also written 2 other books which you've already heard about, one of which is a book on evolution and religion called Finding Darwin's God. And if you're interested in plumbing the depths of my theological views, you can probably do that in that book. And more recently, a book called Only a Theory, Evolution and the Battle for America's Soul. And I've written these books largely because I think how we regard evolution is important. Now, I'm not the only person who feels that way. The National Academy of Sciences does too, and they've been kind enough to shower 5,000 copies of this booklet on Chautauqua, and you may pick it up at the exits to the amphitheater, at the gazebo, or at the bookstore. That's for free, and it's an introduction to a complete book on this issue, which you can purchase in the bookstore as well. So I simply promised my friends at the National Academy that I would do a brief commercial for this, but please pick it up, and I think you'll find it interesting. Now, speaking of interesting, I suppose I could preface what I want to talk about today by saying that we live in interesting times. And one of the best ways to describe this is to recount something that happened about 6 years ago. The second largest school district in the state of Georgia, the Cobb County School District, bought new biology textbooks for each of the 17 high schools in Cobb County, thousands of books. And they picked the book that they thought would be the best in terms of alignment with Georgia's education standards, up to the national standards, accessible to all their students, and so forth. But a lot of people in the community looked through the book and discovered this book has got a lot of evolution in it. It's got a whole section on evolution. They don't like that very much, and they petitioned the school board to do something about it. Well, what the school board did was to put a warning label inside each of the books, sort of like the cigarette package label, basically saying evolution's just a theory, not a fact, don't take it too seriously. And as good public-spirited citizens, I figured you deserve to know which book was it that was so dangerous that it required a warning label. And lo and behold, that's right, it was our book. And this is, I think I'm working up here. This is the warning label. And it says this textbook has material on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact, regarding the origin of living things. This material should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. Now, I remember when this happened, a reporter from the Journal Constitution in Atlanta called me up and said, Dr. Miller, aren't you outraged by the sticker that they've just put in your book? And I thought about that, because I talked to reporters before, and I've never had a reporter put that word in my mouth that way, and I thought, I wonder what she's doing. And then I thought, you know what, I think she's trolling for a quote. She wants me to say something so she can write an article with a headline that says, author incensed, or better yet, northern author upset about this sort of... So I decided I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. And instead I said, no, I love the stickers. She said, you do? I said, I think the stickers are great. They just don't go far enough. And she said, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, the textbook has material on evolution. Yeah, the back cover says Unit 5 evolution. Kids don't need a warning sticker to see that. Then it says evolution is a theory. She says, is evolution a theory? I said, chapter 15 of this book is entitled Darwin's Theory of Evolution. Of course it's a theory. But when you say it's a theory, not a fact, you make it sound like theories and facts are opposite things. They're not. And I said, let me put it this way. Let's suppose a young person went to the University of Georgia to study physics. They have a very good physics department. One of the subjects they'd have to study is called atomic theory. Now, why do we call that atomic theory? Do we call it that because, we're not really sure about atoms? Maybe they exist, maybe they don't. And maybe someday, if we get more evidence, we can change the name of the subject to atomic facts? Well, the answer is of course not. We call it atomic theory because what it does is it explains hundreds of thousands of observational and experimental facts about the nature of matter. And that's what theories do. Theories in science don't become facts. Theories in science explain facts. Theories are actually a higher level of understanding, and evolutionary theory explains hundreds of thousands of facts and observations about the nature of living things. That's why we call it a theory. But I said the sentence that really bugs me, it's the third one. She said, are you against having an open mind? And my answer was, no, of course not, but read that like a 14-year-old. And you know what that says to a 14-year-old? It says we are certain of every single topic in this book except for one, and that's evolution. Be skeptical of that. And she says, so you object to that as an evolutionist? I said, no, I object to that as a cell biologist. Because what that tells students is that everything in my field, cell biology, is all figured out. You don't need an open mind to study cell biology. And you don't need critical analysis to study biochemistry, because we understand all that stuff. I object to that because it implies a false sense of certainty about everything else in science, in addition to a false sense of uncertainty about it. I said, tell you what I'll do. No charge to Cobb County. I'll rewrite the sticker. And the way that I would rewrite it is right here. This textbook has material on science. Science is built around theories which are strongly supported by factual evidence. Everything in science should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. Well, I appreciate your sentiments, but the bad news is the school board didn't feel that way. They left the stickers on. They got sued. They went to court. I actually testified in this trial, and they lost. And the stickers came out. So this case became settled law and a violation of the First Amendment. The short guy in that picture is Jeff Selman, I think a real hero, who is the person who brought that lawsuit on behalf of 5 other parents. Because I testified in the trial, CNN actually called me up the day of the verdict and asked me for a comment. Sorry, not CNN, the Associated Press. And like a fool, I talked to them because I was naive then, and I didn't realize when you speak to the Associated Press reporter, the next morning your name might be in the first line of a story that appears in 1,100 newspapers, which it was. Now, Mom and Dad were very proud, but I got more "you're gonna burn in hell" email that day than I've ever received in my life. And that told me, as much as anything else, how important this is to people in this country. Now, this hasn't changed. I'll give you an example. And again, on the theme that we live in interesting times, I think we are living in a particularly interesting political year. And I recall that early on, when we had a lot of candidates for both parties for president, one of the moderators at one of the debates of one of the parties, I won't mention which one, asked the following question. Is there anybody on this stage who doesn't believe in evolution? And you might remember 3 hands went up. Sam Brownback, Mike Huckabee, and Tom Tancredi. Now, in all fairness, Ron Paul said he was confused, and if he had been thinking clearly, he would have put his hand up too. So there were 4 candidates who rejected evolution. I'm happy to say that both of the major party candidates for president right now say they accept evolution, so I think we'll have someone who respects science in the White House, regardless of which way the election goes. But the guy who really caught my attention was Mike Huckabee. And the reason for that is because I rather liked Huckabee. I thought he was by far the most colorful candidate in either party. He was great to listen to. He was very frank. He plays a mean guitar, which I think we need in a president. But I listened in detail to Huckabee's explanation. And he said, if anybody else wants to believe that they are the descendants of a primate, they are certainly welcome to do so, but he, of course, doesn't. Now, I thought about that for a long time. And I thought about it in part because there were primaries coming up in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, and I actually hoped that I could run into Governor Huckabee. I'm serious about this, because I did like the guy. He's a winning personality, he had a great record as governor of Arkansas. And if I had gotten the chance to shake his hand, I would have said, Governor Huckabee, you know, great guy, keep doing what you're doing, you're really making this race interesting. But just between you and me, I got to tell you something. I'm a biologist, Governor Huckabee. Governor Huckabee, you are a primate. And so were your mom and dad. So don't give me this descendant thing. And he might very well, I can imagine he might come back to me. Who is responsible for saying that humans are primates? You know, maybe it's that evil guy Charles Darwin. And of course, then I'm not going to buy that. But it's not Darwin who's responsible for us being classified as primates. In keeping with the theme for this week, it's not Darwin, it's Linnaeus. Linnaeus, a creationist, is the first person to call us primates. And to let you know to what extent Linnaeus was a creationist, in the frontispiece of his books he wrote, Deus creavit, Linnaeus disposuit. And that means God creates, but Linnaeus arranges. And that's what he saw his work. And there's a nice picture of Carl Linnaeus, or Carl von Linne, which was his given name. And just in case you think I'm pulling your leg on this, we got a copy of one of his books in the rare book collection at Brown. I went there, I pulled out the book, and there is the page in the upper right-hand corner where human beings are classified. You can see Homo, that's our genus, and right at top, primates, primates. We are indeed primates, according to Linnaeus. So this remains an issue. And in fact, if you looked at it nationally, here's a map of the United States. And I thought I would concentrate on what happened in this country with respect to the teaching of evolution over just 3 very interesting years, 2004, 5, and 6. Now, a lot of this was written up in a cover story on Time magazine in the summer of 2005. And in that cover story, they talked about this war over evolution. They pointed out that very often most Americans reject the theory of evolution when they're polled. They pointed out that our president has taken a position on this, not always helpfully, from the point of view of some of us in science. Although Joe Levine, my co-author, and I, we got such a kick out of looking at which textbook Time magazine superimposed President Bush's face on. Take a look at that. That's our textbook. And we liked that because we're always looking for new cover art for our book. And the state of Texas is going to buy new textbooks in about 2 years, and this just might be a winner. So if you see that, that's where it came from. But to focus back on the issue at hand, in this 3-year period, there were 2 federal trials, major federal trials, on the issue of evolution. One in Georgia, I've already mentioned. The other one was in Pennsylvania. In addition, in 2006, there were 2 state elections that turned on the issue of evolution. Now, these were elections for State Board of Education, but they were hotly contested. And you might wonder, gee, what does an election that turns on evolution actually look like? So what I did is I brought in an article from the most widely read newspaper in Ohio, the Plain Dealer, and this is the front page of the Sunday edition, and you can see normally low-profile contest in Spotlight. This was the contest for the State Board of Ed seat in Cleveland, the district where the Plain Dealer is published. And there are the 2 candidates. The one on top is the incumbent. Her name is Deborah Owens Fink. She's a professor of marketing at the University of Akron, and she's sort of the leader of the anti-evolution forces on the Ohio Board of Education. Her opponent was a fellow with the rather memorable name of Tom Sawyer. And Tom had taken a position in favor of evolution. Now, what did this contest look like? Well, a radio talk show host in Cleveland summed it up this way, and this is right out of the article. If you believe in God, creation, and true science, vote for Debbie. If you believe in evolution, abortion, and sin, vote for her opponents. I have seen a lot of analysis of the 2006 elections, but I've never seen one that totaled up the sin vote. Nonetheless, if this talk show host was right, in Ohio, the sin vote must have prevailed because pro-evolution candidates swept the election and beat back a creationist challenge. Don't be too happy, though. These are the states in which an anti-evolution measure has passed at least one house of the state legislature during this period. And if you looked at states in which anti-evolution activity was at least present at the district level, you can color in virtually every single one of the United States. Now, this hit home in the court case that I'm going to mention a little bit in Dover, Pennsylvania. You heard this in the introduction. But the public television program Nova, about a year ago, did a remarkable summation of this. And I just want to show you the teaser from that show that illustrates a little bit of what happens when this controversy hits home in a local community. Here you go.
On Nova.
I believe there is an intelligent design. In the beginning, God created.
Saying that you don't believe in evolution is almost saying we don't believe that the Civil War ever took place in the United States.
An extraordinary court case ignites a small town.
There's like a civil war within the community, there's no question.
And puts science itself on trial.
Very important things were at stake. One is the future of science education in this country.
Nova reveals the story behind
Anywhere you turned, we were getting attacked.
Witnesses started dropping like flies.
and probes the question, is intelligent design a scientific alternative to evolution
Properly the subject of a science class.
or religion in disguise?
It's a violation of everything we mean and everything we understand by science.
Judgment Day, intelligent design on trial on Nova.
Well, my friends at PBS would be remiss if I didn't point out that you can buy the video. And I should also point out that this program won a Peabody Award for broadcast journalism. It was an extraordinary achievement. It was extremely well done, and it really brought to light the drama that took place in this community. And it really was a contentious issue that split the community right down the middle. Now, a few times so far, I've already stumbled into this word, intelligent design. And I think it's only fair to say, what is he talking about? This isn't the creationism that we are used to hearing about in the 60s and 70s and so forth. And I'm going to start off by saying what I don't think intelligent design means in the American context. And that is, I would say that theists, people who believe in God, I think by definition, believe in a transcendent intelligence. And they might express that as a view that there is an intelligent design to the universe. Now, for what it's worth, that's a point of view that I actually share myself. But it is not what is meant by intelligent design in the current context of arguments in the United States. Rather, the intelligent design movement holds forward a proposition, and that is that design, by which they mean outside intelligent intervention, is required to account for the origins of living things. And what this means, in a sense, is that intelligent design is not the same as this general philosophical consideration about meaning and purpose in the universe, and it is instead a doctrine of special creation. When someone says that the animals of the Cambrian explosion were intelligently designed, they mean they were created. When they say that the proteins that clot our blood have the marks of intelligent design, they mean a creator put those proteins and the genes for them together. And this is why I call it a doctrine of special creation. Well, the drama in Dover, about which you just saw that trailer, happened beginning in 2004 actually, when the school board voted for an intelligent design lesson in biology. They had asked the biology teachers in Dover, there's only 3 of them, it's a small town, to prepare a curriculum on intelligent design. The teachers, at the risk of being fired, basically said no, they wouldn't do it because this stuff wasn't science. Well, the school board, exasperated, wrote an intelligent design lesson of their own and said, would you at least read this to the students? And once again, at the risk of their jobs, the teachers said no. So the school board then instructed the superintendent and the assistant superintendent to go into the biology classrooms and read the lessons while the teachers, no kidding, while the teachers literally stood outside in the hallways. The next morning, 11 parents in Dover went to federal court in Harrisburg and filed a lawsuit, which became known as Kitzmiller versus Dover. That unassuming woman in the blue blouse on the upper left-hand side of the slide, that's Tammy Kitzmiller, and her name is linked forever with this. Now, why was the Dover School Board doing this? It turns out they weren't doing this on their own. They were actually following a set of recommendations published by a group of individuals at the Discovery Institute in Seattle, Washington, which is a pro-intelligent design think tank. And you can see the title of this booklet is Intelligent Design in Public School Science Curricula. And this recommended that school districts purchase an intelligent design textbook called Of Pandas and People. And what happened to the Dover board was literally right out of that playbook. They were following a strategy, and they were trying to establish that this stuff was constitutional. Now, the reason I point out that textbook, and the Dover board bought 2 classroom sets of this for use by their students, is the content of the book itself. For example, one of the arguments made in the book is that the fossil record by which we trace evolution doesn't show any evidence of the transitional or intermediate forms that evolution would require if in fact it was true. And here's a couple illustrations from the book. These are illustrations that show some of the fossils involved in the evolution of the first tetrapods. A tetrapod is a 4-legged land vertebrate, and tetrapods evolved from fish. And one of the early groups of lobe-finned fishes, and a representative species of that group is down here, it's called Eusthenopteron. And one of the earliest of the amphibians, the first true tetrapods, was a fossil very well known called Ichthyostega. Now, Ichthyostega is an amphibian, but it looks more like a fish than any amphibian that has ever existed. And Euthenopteron is a true fish, but it has surprisingly large number of amphibian-like characteristics. So both of these fit the definition of true intermediate forms. Here are the front limbs of both of these guys. But what pandas does is to say, look how stupid evolutionists are. They actually think that this turned into that, or that this kind of flipper or fin turned into that limb. And here's what they told students. Remember, this is a textbook for 14-year-olds. How many transitional species were required to bridge this gap? We don't know. But we do know, look at the emphasis, no such transitional species have been recovered. So they tell students, we've never found anything in between. Now, putting all of this in graphic form, here's essentially what they've argued. They've argued that we have Euthenopteron here, Ichthyostega there, the line of evolution to land vertebrates up there, and nothing in between them. Well, even at the time this book was published, that was wrong. I'm tempted to say it was a lie, but that would be too pejorative. And the reason for that is what they had done was to take two species out of a very well understood evolutionary transition, neglecting Panthericthes and Acanthostega, which sit in between them, and pretend that in fact we had never found anything between them. The reality is that these two species were part of a very well understood evolutionary transition. We really understood where this was coming from. But the interesting thing is this evolutionary transition in the years leading up to the trial got even better. Let's focus in on just one part of that transition. Now, I know the slide, especially for those of you in the back, is almost impossible to see the details at, but what I've put in a box is basically the last organism you would possibly call a fish, Panthericthes, and the first organism you'd say, it's probably an amphibian and it certainly lived on land. Can we find anything in between them? Now, how would we find something like that? Where would we look for an intermediate between those two species? This is why evolution is a legitimate theory. It makes predictions. Evolution tells us when that species should have existed. It tells us the sort of habitat that it should have been found in, and also predicts the age and its morphology. So evolution predicts morphology and age. So what you've got to find are sedimentary rock formations formed at a period of time called the Devonian, at an interface between land and water. One of the places on this planet where those exact deposits exist is the Arctic island of Ellesmere in northern Canada. And a group of researchers led by Neil Shubin from the University of Chicago spent 4 summers poking around and digging at Ellesmere looking for the appropriate fossils. For 3 summers, they didn't find anything. 4th summer, funding's about to run out. They're getting desperate. All of a sudden, somebody chips away a piece of rock and they see a little snout pointing out from a cliff. They carefully unearth it, and this is what's under the snout. It's an organism called Tiktaalik. Neil described it as one of the most vivid transitional fossils ever discovered. It had well-preserved scales on its back, just like a fish. It had webbed fins, just like a fish. It had a flat head with eyes on top, which is an early amphibian characteristic, and it had actual limbs to support the body. You couldn't get a better intermediate if you tried. So what has happened in just the last couple of years is that a set of evolutionary transitions going from the bony flippers of lobe-fin fish on the left to the first true load-bearing limbs of a tetrapod on the right was already pretty good. But we have plugged Tiktaalik, the fossil that Neil Shubin and his group discovered, right in there. And then about a year after they did that, another group found another organism that plugs in on the fishy side of this transition, and this is called Goganathus. So the more fossils we dig up, the better the evidence gets for this evolutionary transition. And Neil Shubin, who did this work at the University of Chicago, said, look, the fish to amphibian transition, or the fish to tetrapod transition, is now one of the most thoroughly documented in all of the fossil record. And I think Neil put it like a scientist and a gentleman. I have a former student who is a scientist, but he's not much of a gentleman. His name is Colin Parrington. He teaches at Swarthmore University. Here's a picture of Colin and one of his friends. And what Colin told me is, Ken, next time you get in a debate with a creationist, next time you're in court or something like that, don't mince words, don't show them a lot of pictures, don't show them a lot of DNA sequences, end it with one sentence. There it is. We have the fossils, we win. Colin is probably going to start writing bumper stickers for a living. I think he's got this right. Now, the result of this, and I don't have time to give you everything in detail, is that the trial demolished any contention that this thing called intelligent design was a legitimate scientific theory. This is actually the NBC TV courtroom sketch of my cross-examination in court. You can see the attorney for the other side pressing close. Those are my books piled on the desk of the attorney. And you know, nothing I've ever done in my whole life had ever prepared me for 6 or 7 hours of cross-examination in court by a skilled and very hostile attorney. And it was an incredible experience. I never want to do it again, but I'm glad that I did it. And during the course of this trial, which I have to tell you something. I'm going to tell you how long the trial lasted. And this is also when we knew we'd won the case. On the last day for closing arguments, one of the attorneys for the Board of Education said, Your Honor, I don't know if you realize this, but this trial has lasted 40 days and 40 nights. And then the judge, John Jones from the bench, looked back at him with a big smile and a wink and said, but it wasn't by design. That's when we kind of knew how it was coming down. And what happened in the trial is what I often refer to as the icons of intelligent design, the biochemical icons, which I had to deal with being a cell and molecular biologist, were exposed as false. And what I mean by that is a whole set of arguments, which I don't have enough time in this venue to go into, but I did write about in my books. Arguments saying that the bacterial flagellum could not have evolved, the proteins that clotted our blood could not have evolved, or the immune system in all its complexity could not have evolved for various reasons. We simply took those arguments apart one at a time and showed that they were in fact invalid. One of the most interesting aspects of the trial is it showed how thoroughly we could show that intelligent design was actually a religious doctrine masquerading as science. And I want to show you how this was done, because I played no role in this, but I think this was the key part of the trial. The intelligent design textbook, Pandas and People, is published by a group called the Texas Foundation for Thought and Ethics. The attorneys for our side issued a subpoena to the publishers asking if this book had ever been published under a different name. Are there editorial drafts, correspondence, page proofs? I didn't think they'd get anything for this. And instead, they got 2 boxes of material. Well, a woman named Barbara Forrest, a professor at Southeastern Louisiana University, went through these, and Barbara and I are friends, and she called me up and said, Ken, let me tell you what's in these boxes. And she described it to me, and I just shook my head. All I could think of was, didn't these people learn anything from the Nixon administration? You got to burn this stuff. You can't leave this stuff around. And let me show you what I mean. This is the definition of intelligent design from Pandas. Now, read it carefully. Intelligent design means the various forms of life begin abruptly through an intelligent agency with their distinctive features already intact. Fish with fins and scales, birds with feathers, beaks and wings, etc. Sounds very scientific. And there is nothing in this book about Jesus, the Bible, Genesis. It sounds entirely non-religious. But we discovered that this book had actually been prepared under a different name. We didn't know about it. That's why. Called Biology and Origins. And when Barbara went through that, she was able to match it, paragraph for paragraph, with the book that was being given to the school kids in Dover. And look at what this book said. Creation means the various forms of life began abruptly through an intelligent... It's the same paragraph. And all these guys did was to fire up Microsoft Word and do a find and replace creator with designer. And Barbara even found what we called a word processor fossil of an incorrect replacement that mixed the words creationist and design proponents in a very comical way. And as she worked so hard on this, I have to show you what she did. She went through all the earlier versions and editions of this, and she counted up the number of times that intelligent design was mentioned. That's in blue. and the number of times creation was mentioned, and that's in red. And you'll notice the early versions are all about creation and nothing about intelligent design. Watch this. All of a sudden, intelligent design zooms up and creation drops to 0. And this is the result of the find and replace. Now, the really cool thing about this, and I know you can't read the type, is the last version to be heavy on creationism is early 87. The first version to mention intelligent design as a replacement is late 87. And what that tells you is that something remarkable once happened in 1987. Now, I gave a talk earlier this year at North Carolina State University, and I told the students, you look like a really bright group. Tell me what happened in 1987 that prompted this change. And a kid in the front, and I said, he must know what this is. And I said, what happened in 1987? And he sat up and very proudly he said, I was born. And I told him, sir, I'm sure that was a remarkable event, but I'm not sure that's why they changed the textbook. Here's why they did it. This is a timeline of litigation, lawsuits, on the theory of evolution. It starts way over there on the left with the Scopes trial. It's got Epperson versus Arkansas, which made it legal to teach evolution in every state. But lo and behold, in 1987, there was a Supreme Court case called Edwards versus Aguillard. And this is the definitive case that said creation and creation science are inherently religious and you can't teach them in the classroom. What happened is these people suddenly read the papers. The Supreme Court says our book can't go into the classroom. Quick, we got to call it something else. Anybody got any ideas? Intelligent design. And that's how the intelligent design movement came out. A deliberate subterfuge to cloak creationism in new language and try to put it into the classroom. And this was enormously persuasive to the judge. Now, as I mentioned, I had the honor, although I'm not sure that's the right word, of being the lead witness for the plaintiffs. Got a lot of burn in hell email that day as well. It was an extraordinary experience, but I have to tell you, to me, the most amazing thing about this was being part of an extraordinary group of people who got together over the course of this 7-week trial. And I put some of their names on this slide. And a few of these people are going to be around here this week. Eugenie Scott on the left is from the National Center for Science Education. John Haught, next to her, is a theologian from Georgetown University. It really confounded the other side that we had a theologian from a Catholic university on our side of the case. Barbara Forrest, next one over, she's the woman who did this remarkable work analyzing the manuscript and the ID movement. You already know me. Brian Alter is a specialist in education from McGill University in Montreal. Rob Pennick from Michigan State. And then the guy on the right is Nick Matsky, who was a grad student. Actually, he wasn't even a grad student, just had a bachelor's degree. And Nick did almost all of the scientific legwork. He didn't testify, but he was our sort of scientific resource all the way through the trial. When the trial was ended just before Christmas in 2005, federal judge John Jones ruled that intelligent design was clearly not science, and this set a precedent. Now, it didn't set a legal precedent because this case was not appealed to either the Circuit Court or the Supreme Court, and it will never be appealed. And the reason for that is the only people withstanding that's a legal term, to appeal this case were the Dover School Board. And while the trial was going on, there was a school board election in Dover. And the voters of Dover threw the old school board out. And they replaced them with a school board that included 3 of the plaintiffs in this case. So needless to say, the current board is very happy and they're not about to appeal it. Now, the publicity surrounding the case led to a few very strange things, which I thought about and decided I would not inflict upon you today. But if you have a few minutes to waste, you can always do this. And I want to show you one of those weird outcomes. If you want to Google Ken Miller and Colbert Report, you will come up with a video of me on the Colbert Report about a month after the trial ended. And I had such a good time with Stephen Colbert that when my new book came out, Stephen decided to invite me back. And on June 16th, I was at the Colbert Report again. And I have to tell you that nothing I have ever done in my entire scientific career has ever gained for me the credibility with my students of being on the Colbert Report. And that's, when you think about it, that's probably a very sad commentary on the state of higher education today. But nonetheless, those are the breaks. I've thought about this for a long time, and over the last year or so, I've worked on a new book called Only a Theory, Evolution and the Battle for America's Soul, and I thought I would tell you what's in this book. The first thing is the evolution battle is not over. I mean, we'd love to say, hey, Dover verdict, end of story. Not true. In fact, not true by a long shot. Also, it's not a battle over evolution, by and large. It is a battle over how scientific rationalism is to be regarded in our society. And evolution is just sort of the cutting edge of the knife. The real goal of the anti-evolution movement is to change the way in which we understand science. And my premise in writing this book is simple. It matters for our country's future. When I said evolution in the battle for America's soul, a lot of people ask me, what sort of soul am I thinking about? I think this country has a scientific soul. I think there's a reason why the United States remains the leading country for science in the world. A lot of people might say, well, we've been the richest country, we buy all the... It's more to it than that. And the Europeans who have come over here to make scientific careers in this country, and now Asians who have come over to make scientific careers in the country, they'll tell you something about the United States. And that is, the culture of individualism in the United States makes it much easier to be a creative scientist here than it does in most other cultures, in part because to do really groundbreaking scientific work, you have to go against the grain. You have to cut against the prevailing wisdom. And in the US, we kind of glorify the lone outsider, the maverick, and so forth. And in other countries, there's much more of a culture of getting along and pleasing your superiors. And for all the advancement in Europe and the rising countries in Asia, they look, believe me, they do, they look at the United States as the model for science. The greatest European laboratory, large laboratory in my field, is EMBO, the European Molecular Biology Laboratory in Heidelberg. And when EMBO was first set up, what they decided they wanted to do was to create an American-style scientific culture in Europe. And that's the way they looked at this country. Well, I think that scientific culture, that scientific soul of our society is at risk for this reason. Now, let's go back to this intelligent design question. Even the most fervent advocates of intelligent design admit that it's a scientific failure. This is Philip Johnson. Philip Johnson is a recently retired law professor at the University of California at Berkeley. And Johnson is, everyone acknowledges, the sort of intellectual godfather of the intelligent design movement. And in an interview 2 years ago, what he admitted is astonishing. He said, I don't think there really is a theory of intelligent design at the present time to propose as a comparable alternative to the Darwinian theory, which is, whatever errors, in his opinion, it might contain, it's a fully worked out scheme. There is no intelligent design theory that's comparable, and then the bottom of the quote, no product is ready for competition in the educational world. And this is from the founder and leader of the intelligent design movement. But despite this admission, intelligent design remains a public relations success story. A poll of industrialized countries asked about 1,000 people in each country, do you accept the theory of evolution or not? And if you said yes, you end up on the blue bar. If you said no, I don't, you end up on the red bar. Where's the United States on that list? We are next to the bottom in terms of it. We beat Turkey in terms of our acceptance of evolution. Now, if you're an intelligent design advocate, you might say, hey, that's good news. Because when intelligent design is proved to be right, we'll flip the chart upside down and we'll automatically be in second place. But I don't hold that as much cause for optimism. I find that pretty depressing and pretty disconcerting. Now, why is it that this movement remains a public relations success story? Now, a lot of us would point to biblical literalism. And they would say a lot of people reject evolution because it contradicts the Bible. I think that's probably partially true. But biblical literalism is really only part of the story. Any poll of Americans that ask questions designed to see if they are biblical literalists, meaning they think the Bible is not only the Word of God, but has to be scientifically accurate in every detail, reveals only about 14 or 15% of Americans fall into that category. But 3 times as many reject the theory of evolution. Well, why do they do it? I think part of this is the success of something called the wedge strategy. And the wedge strategy, the wedge document, is a strategy written by Philip Johnson from Berkeley about 15 years ago as a way to drive a wedge between what he calls scientific materialism and the scientific process. And intelligent design is a key part of the wedge strategy. And he said in one of these, in this particular document, we are building on momentum, broadening the wedge with a positive scientific alternative to materialist scientific theories, which has come to be called the theory of intelligent design. Now, when I read this argument that Johnson made, and the essence of his strategy is saying you have to allow alternative theories, why not look at both sides, into the scientific classroom, it reminded me of something. And it reminded me of a book. Boy, that's one heck of a cell phone. Reminded me of a book that I read about 25 years ago. And that book was Alan Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind. Now, it's an interesting book. It's really an analysis of the state of the humanities in American higher education in the 1980s. But the book impressed me. I was a new college professor then, and I thought about it. And this metaphor of the American mind becoming closed, how can you say that on college campuses the mind of America is closed? College campuses are like the most open places in the world. Well, here's what Bloom was talking about. He said the American mind, particularly in academia, has become closed precisely because it has become too open. Now, what did he mean by that? What he wrote was that openness was the virtue that used to permit us to seek the good by using reason. But from his point of view, openness now means accepting everything uncritically and denying reason's power. The unrestrained and thoughtless pursuit of openness without recognizing the inherent consequences or problem of openness as the goal of nature has rendered openness meaningless. He said it in another place in the book, in academia, the worst sin you can commit now is to come to a conclusion about anything. Because coming to a conclusion means you're closed-minded, you're bigoted, you're prejudiced. And this uncritical acceptance of alternate ideas was destroying academia. You have to be open to everything, but then once you consider them, you have to use facts and reason to make your choices. And he was emphasizing the humanities, but you could apply this to the sciences as well. Interestingly, he wasn't picked up by, but he was basically responding to many critiques of science that come from what I would call the far academic left. Here's a book by Paul Feyerabend, a Marxist, critiquing science. And here's what Feyerabend said about science. Science is much closer to myth than a scientific philosophy is prepared to admit. It's one of the many forms of thought that have been developed by man, and it's not necessarily the best. It's conspicuous, noisy, and impudent, but it is inherently superior only for those who have already decided in favor of a certain ideology or who have accepted it without ever having examined its advantages and limits. In other words, science is not really the objective search for the truth. Now, this is coming from the extreme left of the political spectrum, but it's almost exactly the argument about science and ideology that you see in the Wedge document. Now, how does intelligent design, something we see on the right, adopt this kind of critique of science? Well, remember that Philip Johnson was a professor at Cal Berkeley. And I like to tell my friends in academia that intelligent design is just one of many bad ideas to come out of Berkeley. But think hard about this. Who better to adapt the lingo and the terminology of the academic left than Philip Johnson at Berkeley, where he was steeped every day in the lingo of the academic left. And that's actually what you see. What Alan Bloom called this false openness to all ideas and the refusal to come to a critical decision. Now, if this is too much of a theoretical discussion for you, I apologize, but it's not theoretical right now, because it's being applied right now in the state of Louisiana, where Bobby Jindal, the new governor of Louisiana, has just signed a bill making it very clear that these alternate theories, even if they have very little scientific standing, are going to have legal protection in the classrooms of Louisiana. This just happened. We will see where it leads. Now, once again, let's go back to that point as to why evolution is truly a target from this point of view. And for my authority on this, I want to take Rick Santorum, former senator from the state of Pennsylvania. And incidentally, I think many of you will enjoy this. You may know that federal judges have to be recommended for the bench by one of their state senators. The senator who recommended John Jones, who heard the Dover case, was Rick Santorum. I heard Santorum on NPR a couple summers ago, and he was asked, why are you so critical of evolution? This was in a new book he had published. Here's what he told the interview, and I thought, man, that nails it. That's it. It, meaning evolution, has huge consequences for society. I mean, it's where we come from. Does man have a purpose? Is there a purpose to our lives? Or are we, just the result of chance? And he went on. if we're the result of chance, if we're simply a mistake of nature, that puts a different moral demand on us. In fact, it doesn't put a moral demand on us than, in fact, if we are a creation of a being that has moral demands. Now, that's not all that grammatical, but remember, it's ex-temp on the radio. And what he's saying is that if Darwin was right, morality, good and evil, the right thing and the wrong thing, is all an illusion. And for someone who had tried to organize his life around a certain moral sense, this would be disaster. Now, Santorum's misunderstanding, I think, of the meaning of evolution is part and parcel of why science is in trouble in the country today. And I think science has allowed itself to be forced into a corner by this design argument. And many of my colleagues in science recoil from what they regard as the theological implications of design, which of course requires a designer, and they fool themselves by, in effect, getting up and arguing that there is no design in nature. Now, in a religious nation like ours, this really plays into the hands of those who oppose evolution and science in general. And the reason for that is arguing that there is no design in nature implies that the form and the function of living things are simply the random and accidental mistakes of nature, just like Rick Santorum said they were. And if you and I are random and accidental mistakes, our lives have no significance, the choices we make have no significance, and morality itself is an illusion. But remember that statement. Living things are just the random and accidental mistakes in nature. In closing today, I want to make a simple argument. They aren't. And I want to make the argument in this way. Here's the reality. Life is material. That's something Madonna got right, by the way. Life is material, and the capacity for life is built into the physics and chemistry of matter itself. And evolution, therefore, is an inherent and a predictable property of nature. It's not a mistake. It's something that matter itself allows. And evolutionary processes explore what biologists often call adaptive space, and it explores it in kind of a predictable way. And it is driven by a very non-random force, natural selection. Natural selection is not random at all. And by the reality of the laws of physics and chemistry, which are also non-random. Now, what does all this mean? It means that the evolutionary design of life is a part of the inherent fabric of the natural world. Evolution isn't a strange add-on. It is built into nature itself. So the lesson in this respect, and here's how I put the lesson, is that the idea of design is not a theologically inspired illusion to be dismissed. It is a scientific reality to be embraced. How come? To rescue the argument from design for the cause of science, and to enlist it in the cause of science. I'll give you an example of what I mean. Does the human body have a design? Well, I think it does. Reverend William Paley, 50 years before Darwin, wrote a book called Natural Theology, in which he argued the design of the human body is a design given by God. Well, I think the human body does have a design, but it's the design produced by evolution. And if you want to read a marvelous book on the way in which our bodies are designed by the process of evolution, I couldn't strongly enough recommend a book called Your Inner Fish by Neil Shubin, who's the discoverer of the Tiktaalik fossil that I talked about earlier. And what Neil argues is when we look at DNA, when we look at fossils, we discover that our hands are actually resemble and are built by the same genes that produce fins in fish. Our head is organized like that of an extinct jawless fish, and major parts of our genome function like those of worms and bacteria. Surprising, but absolutely true. Do proteins, these things that make life possible, do they have designs? And the answer is absolutely. We talk about the design of proteins all the time, but what we mean by design is the exquisite correlation produced by evolution between structure and function. Now, I'm running short on time, so I'm going to rush a little bit, but let me start. This is something I absolutely have to mention. Does the human genome have a design? This is the cover of an issue of Nature that appeared 2 weeks before the Dover trial started. And when I saw the article in here, it was the chimpanzee genome sequence. I called up our attorneys. I said, gentlemen, this is a gift from God. We have to bring this into the courtroom. And the reason that we had to bring it in the courtroom is shown here. The lead sentence of the article: more than a century ago, Darwin proposed that we have recent common ancestors with the African great apes. Modern molecular studies have spectacularly confirmed this prediction. Indeed, they had. But we had to find a way, and I mean no offense to anyone in the audience, we had to find a way to point this out in terms so simple that even an attorney could understand them. So I want to show you how we actually did it in the trial. We've known for a variety of lines of evidence that we humans share recent common ancestors with the other great apes, gorillas, orangs, chimpanzees, and so forth. But we have 46 chromosomes. All the other guys have 48. Now what that means, of course, is you got 23 chromosomes from mom and 23 from dad. So you have 23 pairs. But all the other great apes have 24 pairs. So how could we be missing a pair? Well, the only possible explanation that's consistent with evolution is the two chromosomes that were once separate in other organisms got accidentally stuck together to form a single chromosome in us. That would drop us, or our ancestors, from 24 pairs down to 23, and that's the evolutionary explanation. But here's why evolution is science and not conjecture. That makes a prediction, and it's a testable prediction, which is if that really happened, somewhere in our genome, we ought to be able to find the Scotch tape holding those two parts of a chromosome together. And if we do find it, prediction fulfilled. But if we don't, evolution, common ancestry might be on shaky ground. Now, how would we find that? It turns out it's much easier than you might think. The tips of human chromosomes have special DNA sequences on them called telomeres. I colored them red here. I colored them blue, excuse me. The DNA sequences are easily identifiable. Near the center, you have another equally special sequence called a centromere. I colored that red. If one of our chromosomes was formed by the fusion of two primate chromosomes, you know what that chromosome should look like? It should have telomere DNA where it doesn't belong, in the center of the chromosome, and it should have two centromeres. So all we have to do is look at our genome and say, do we have such a chromosome? The answer is, we sure do. It's chromosome number 2. Human chromosome number 2 has telomere DNA in the center. It has two centromeres, which correspond to primate chromosomes 12 and 13. It's exactly the fulfillment of the prediction of evolutionary common ancestry. Is there any way that you can explain these facts? And these are facts. Any way you can explain these and the idea that our species was uniquely intelligently designed? And the answer is no, you just can't. Unless you want to argue that the designer rigged our second chromosome to fool us into believing we had evolved, in which event you believe in what I call the Steve Martin school of theology, which is that God did this just to show us he's a wild and crazy guy. Does life itself have a design? I would argue yes. Even Erwin Schrödinger, who wrote the seminal book, What is Life?, argued that the design of living things is a design produced and dictated by the laws of chemistry and physics. And that's the sort of design I talk about. Now, this really is the conclusion. To religious people, the source of this ultimate order in nature, the order that we investigate in science, is in fact God. And as a scientist who is also religious, like a lot of other scientists, that's also what I believe. But if you're a non-religious person, that order in nature, you have to come up with another source for that order in nature. But here's what makes science unifying to people whom you might think have fundamental theological differences, and that is, in either case, the study of that nature, whether the order comes from a creator or the order is self-existing and self-explanatory, the study of that nature is the same. And that is what makes the scientific enterprise work, and that's why so many of us in science, even people of faith in science, recoil against these assaults from the intelligent design movement. And what I would argue, in a sense, is that a material science devoted to the study of nature need not be hostile to religious faith, nor must such a faith be hostile to science. And if you are a person of faith and it only sounds like too much materialism for you, I have a short answer from C.S. Lewis, and that is, God likes matter, he invented it. And I think that's a very good way to put it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
They hated it. Those of you who have to leave now, we understand you have to get on to things, but if you'll do so quietly, please, out of respect for those who stay behind, we'd really appreciate it. Those of you who are staying behind for the question and answer period, our ushers are going about and they'll try to collect your questions, and then Leslie and I will do the best we can to represent them to Dr. Miller. Ken, to begin this process, let me just ask you a little bit about there's lots of studies that say that we're trailing other countries in the world in terms of the education of science. We're not testing as well, and so the example you used about the presidential debate in which three huge figures declare what they declared, is that descriptive, do you think, of an overall atmosphere in this country about the rejection of science, for one thing? And secondly, at a time when the ecology, pandemics, and other issues that are before us in very personal and immediate terms all rely on our understanding complex science and being able to project, it seems that we're not having a very uninformed or complex debate about these matters. Is all of this related?
Yeah, I do think it's all related. I belong to a group of about 2,000 scientists who have informally but intensely lobbied for a science debate as part of the presidential election process. We really wanted to have this in the primaries. We wanted to have the candidates presented with scientific issues. We were hoping to have cooperation from some of the broadcasters and trying to interest some of the campaigns. None of the campaigns has shown any interest in a science debate on either side of the political spectrum. I find that a little bit depressing, especially in light of the fact that I've never seen a time in my life when as many of the issues that you see on the front page, from research on embryonic stem cells to global warming to biofuels to the procurement of energy, to any of these things, I've never seen a time when scientific issues dominated the crises and the problems that we face in the country as much as they do right now. So I find that to be a little bit disconcerting. I will tell you that part of the American tendency to reject evolution, and I wrote about this in my new book, I think comes from a good part of the American character. And that good part is ingrained disrespect for authority. And that disrespect, one of my British colleagues once told me, says, I don't understand what's going on over there in the States. If there was some school board up in the Midlands who was about to reject evolution, here's what we'd do. We'd dispatch a couple of authorities from Oxford and Cambridge. They would show up at a meeting. They'd tell them which royal societies they belonged to and what their credentials were. And they explained to the local people why they were wrong. The local people would then apologize for taking up their valuable time, and they would then change what they were doing. Why wouldn't that work in the U.S.? And my quick answer was, you don't get out much, do you? The reality is that one of the things that's really different between Europe and the United States is, A, this inherent disrespect we have for authority. And I think that goes into part of why we're a great scientific nation, because you need a certain disrespect for authority to be a creative scientist. But the second thing that Europeans frankly don't understand is the American tradition of local control of education. Education is centralized. In all European countries, there's a single tradition. And even if some people in a community don't much like this or that or something else they're teaching in schools, they have no hope of influencing the bureaucrats in Paris or Berlin or wherever. In the U.S., if a local school board wants to do something within limits, they give it a shot. And I think that's one of the big differences. Got all this together now?
Yes.
Okay, fire away.
There are a certain number of scientists who are leaving the United States in order to perform stem cell research. Do you think that we're in danger of losing our lead in scientific endeavors because of interference of the political process?
To some extent, I think that's true, but I want to give more of a global perspective to this. I'll tell you where those scientists are not going. They're not going to Germany or the European Molecular Biology Lab. And the reason for that is in Germany, and this is sort of an outcome, a reaction to some of the excesses, many of the excesses of the Nazi regime in Germany, the stem cell research and human embryo and human subject research is more restricted in Germany than it is in the United States. Now, where many of those scientists are going is they're going to Great Britain, and some of them are going to some of the emerging countries in the Asian Rim. Singapore, in particular, has been very attractive, and so is South Korea. So I think we are in danger, and we've always taken for granted that brain drain only goes one way. But increasingly, in my field, cell biology, I have seen some of my colleagues leave the United States, and I am concerned about that. And the subject of today's lecture was not stem cell research, but I'm going to put in a plug for this research anyway for a very simple reason. I actually would predict that in a decade, the controversies we have right now about the use of embryonic cells in research, these controversies will be moot. We won't be talking about them in a decade. And the reason for that is the technology in the biological level is proceeding so quickly that it now looks as though we have 3 or 4 different ways to take adult cells and reprogram them so they act like embryonic stem cells. Now, that's not complete yet, and some of this research, some of the techniques are tricky, and some may even be dangerous. But we are unraveling the cellular signals for stemminess, if you will, in embryonic stem cells so quickly that I think, quite frankly, as a practical matter, within a decade, we will no longer have to create and destroy embryos in order to get cells with those capabilities. So I'm optimistic that we will do a technological end run about this problem, but I will guarantee you that emerging countries around the world look on the United States as a pool of scientific talent, and they're going to try to recruit it.
There are 2 rather long questions here about